I'm really delighted to be here in Vancouver. I love the city of Vancouver and really appreciate the invitation to come. And I'm very honored to be invited to be the third speaker in the Professor John Howe's series and to meet many of the alums and former students and colleagues who have so generously contributed to this lecture series. It is truly an honor to be here. So as Sherilyn just told you, for decades I've been reading, admiring, puzzling over, and often struggling to produce English versions of thousands of Japanese poems. These have mainly been tanka, the 31-syllable Japanese poems that dominate the Japanese poetic tradition so decidedly that they're also called waka, or Japanese poem. Waka are the most prominent Japanese poetic form from the very earliest anthology, the 8th century Manyoshu, and they continue to be produced in great numbers in today's Japan. In addition to doing some poetry reading today, I'd like to consider some issues related to problems and challenges of translation, specifically translation of poetry, and more specifically translation of waka, aspects of what the cognitive scientist and translator Douglas Hofstadter has called the endless permutations of verbal, imagistic, and formal possibilities in transposing a poem from one cultural context to another. If you haven't read Hofstadter's Le Tombeau de Marot, which is in English in spite of its title, I really highly recommend it. He is also the author of Gödel, Escher, and Bach, which some of you may be familiar with, and he's a fascinating thinker and writer. I'd also like to think about the related and overlapping process of transmission, how the fundamentals of waka were transmitted from one generation to another over the centuries, and how we can continue to transmit them in the 21st century and in other languages and cultures. With Hofstadter again, I'd like to extend the idea of translation to include many of the aspects of transmission of literature between frames of reference, not just restatement in a different language within a different culture, but transformation into different media as well. Indeed, even between one person's thoughts and another. All of these are aspects of translation broadly defined. And finally, I'll talk briefly about some aspects of the compositional practices of waka poets that affected the continuity of the tradition and its transmission, and that I think can inform the teaching of waka today, practices that I'll call experiential learning. Waka gave rise to all of the other prominent pre-modern Japanese poetic forms, including linked verse, or renga, which became widely popular in Japan's medieval period from around the 13th century on, and the haikai, linked verse, and haiku traditions that developed a few centuries later also grew out of and in contrast to the waka tradition. I was recently involved in a translation project of a collection of contemporary tanka that were written in response to the tsunami, earthquake, and nuclear meltdown that began March 11th, 2011. Translating those poems really brought home to me how firmly those contemporary poets, most of whom live in northeastern provinces that the 17th century haikai poet Bashō called the interior, or oku, in his Journey to the Interior, how firmly those modern poets remain aware of the classical tradition and how that tradition supports their contemporary expression of very real and powerful and horrible, in some instances, experiences and emotions. The form, language, and tropes of the tanka written in response to the recent disasters all reminded me of the many ways these contemporary Japanese poets, professionals and amateurs alike, ground their own composition in the literary tradition and use it as a scaffold for their own creativity. So the tradition these contemporary poets still look to is found to a great extent in the 21 imperial anthologies that were compiled at the Japanese court between the early 10th century and the mid-15th centuries. 3 decades ago, as Sherilyn mentioned, I translated the Kokinshū, or collection of poems ancient and modern, which was the first of those anthologies. and the one that became the model both for the expectations of what a waka should be and for the structure of a poetic anthology. One of the things that project required was that I deal with the deliberate and elaborate and unique in some ways means by which poems are linked one to another in the Japanese literary tradition, either through intertextual allusions by poets writing variations on earlier poems, or perhaps uniquely in world literature, by their integration into sequences of poems by multiple authors. The Kokinshū was compiled by a committee of courtiers at the behest of the Emperor Daigo, and the 1,111 poems in it were accompanied by an influential Japanese preface by Kino Tsurayuki. Together, the preface and the poems they introduced fixed the basic style and form of Japanese poetry, defined the aesthetics of Japanese courtly literary tradition, and established the canons of Japanese poetic taste for centuries to come. Tsurayuki's Japanese preface opens with some famous lines about the nature of Japanese poetry, lines that depict poetry as a natural response of all living beings to the world around them. He wrote, "The seeds of Japanese poetry lie in the human heart and grow into the leaves of a myriad words. Many things happen to the people of this world, and all that we feel is given expression and description of things we see and hear. When we hear the warbling of the mountain thrush in the blossoms, or the voice of the frog in the water, we know every living being has its song. It's poetry which, without effort, moves heaven and earth, stirs the feelings of the invisible gods and spirits, smooths the relations of men and women, and calms the hearts of fierce warriors." Back up a minute. So although the statement suggests that any living thing naturally celebrates the world in song, the poetry the poetry included in the Kokinshū was actually very much an aristocratic poetry, with the subject matter largely limited to topics deemed appropriate to courtly sensibilities, featuring descriptions of the phenomena of the changing seasons and the expression of human emotions. The particular topics, subtopics, and attitudes toward them presented in the Kokinshū became the model for poetic composition for later centuries, as tens, maybe even hundreds, possibly even thousands of waka were written, collected in public and private anthologies, woven into works of prose literature, or included in diaries. Okay. And so, recently, I've completed a translation of what's actually the 8th poetry anthology, the Shinkokinshū, or the new collection of poems, ancient and modern, which was compiled in the early 1200s, almost exactly 300 years after the Kokinshū. Like the other imperial anthologies, the Shinkokinshū was intended to express the spirit of the age and to celebrate the greatness as well as to reaffirm the courtly literary tradition. It was completed in the early years of the Kamakura period, which saw a shift of political power from the Heian court to the Kamakura military government, or Bakufu. Succession disputes in the 12th century led to 2 outbreaks of warfare in the Heian capital, which set the stage for the climactic Genpei Wars and the establishment of the medieval system that was to follow. As Paul Varley has written, Japan in the late 1100s was transformed from a comparatively powerful and tranquil country under the rule of the imperial court to a tumultuous, strife-filled age of warriors. However, at the imperial court, still the center of production of waka and other aristocratic arts, the 18-year-old Emperor Go-Toba gave up the throne in 1198 and turned his attention to aesthetic pursuits. Recognized for his gifts as a calligrapher, painter, musician, equestrian, and archer, he was also a skilled waka poet. So despite the political and social turmoil, the latter years of the 12th century and early years of the 13th saw waka production flourish. Go-Toba and his circle organized poetic events at a rapid pace, building up to the massive 1,500-round poetry contest of 1201 and producing an enormous stock of poems from which the compilers of the new anthology could choose. 2 of the great poets of the Shinkokinshū, were Fujiwara no Shinsei and his son Teika, both of whom also wrote influential waka criticism and advocated a sort of neoclassical approach to poetry, using the phrase old diction, new treatment, or more literally, old words, new heart or mind, recommending that poets draw on the language of the first 3 imperial anthologies in particular. Shinsei wrote that if a poem is a good poem, it will possess a kind of atmosphere distinct from its words and their configuration, and yet accompanying them. The goal for them was to use familiar words and phrases, increasingly loaded with familiar associations and connotations, but to combine them in new ways to convey new impressions. This sort of approach to composition led to the situation that Ed Kamens has described this way. To a great extent, the work of the poet in this tradition was the ingenious rearrangement of materials into new poems that transparently displayed their points of contact with, as well as departure from, earlier poems. So when we talk about the classical Japanese poetry, then we're talking about a very brief form of poetry, 31-syllable waka, that has persisted over centuries as a dominant verse form. The volume of poems is overwhelming, and the effect of the poems rests very heavily on their reception by an educated audience that could recognize the nuances of the freight of traditional associations they carry. The circle of poets and audience at the Japanese court was a very small group, and the social expectations that anyone should be able to produce a waka at the drop of a hat in response to a moving experience or to an interlocutor or a correspondent or at the command of an emperor or a superior meant that everyone at court had to be able to produce, at the minimum, a decent poem that followed the rules. In the case of waka, then, the audience was one that was thoroughly familiar with the literature because it was an audience made up of people who were themselves poets. It was an audience prepared to respond to nuances, connotations, traditional patterns of images, and allusions to in preset ways. It was an audience, in short, of connoisseurs, a small circle of poets who exchanged poems and who recognized and appreciated the intertextual elements, even when they felt constrained by them. Waka was the premier literary art of the Heian court. For centuries, courtship and proposals of marriage were conducted through poetry, and all the other expressions of sentiment that courtiers needed to produce, congratulations, apologies, greetings, expressions of grief or sorrow, statements of religious devotion, even complaints about lack of promotion, were all conveyed through poetry. Composition of poetry was central to both informal and formal events in the lives of the aristocracy. Reputations were made and lost by poetic prowess or lack thereof, and rank and position at court could well depend upon poetic skill. So the waka collected in the imperial collections was very much a court poetry, poetry that addressed the elevated themes and topics and activities of the courtiers, and that expressed sentiments that were seen as being courtly in some fashion. It had a strictly limited range of topics, tropes, images, situations, and tones or emotions. What we find in the Kokinshū and the later collections of poetry that took on, is poetry that took on a role as a sort of guide to what was important to attend to in the world and to appropriate emotional expression, a sort of poetry of emotional correctness, if you will. Waka told or taught how a person should respond and provided training in how to do so. Gus Helt's recent study of the Kokinshū, The Pursuit of Harmony, provides an extended analysis of the way poetic language came to be seen to have both political and cosmological consequences, as well as artistic ones. It had real consequence in a way that it's hard to imagine today. The language of poetry, the vocabulary and phrases that were seen as appropriate to waka, became, through repeated use in waka, a kind of coded language, or a shorthand for poets to use in expressing their own experiences and responses, with variety provided by sometimes very subtle variations on a theme, which always reminds me of something like Wallace Stevens' 13 Ways of Looking at a Blackbird, only writ extremely large. So I don't mean to scare non-courtiers off, however. There are plenty of memorable and really powerful, I think, immediately engaging poems in the Japanese literary tradition that appeal to any reader of poetry, no matter their background. Some of them, like Bashō's famous haiku, have become part of the world literary tradition. I'm going to go ahead and read all of these. If I run out of time, I'll stop reading. Kareeda ni karasu no tomarikiri, aki no yūre. On a withered branch, a crow has settled, evening in autumn. Shizukasa ya, iwa ni shimiiru semi no koe. Stillness, penetrating the rocks, cicadas' cries. When it comes to translation, one quickly realizes that these haiku are more complicated than one might anticipate of a 17-syllable poem. In addition to thinking of the semantic content, which presents its own challenges, we need to read them aloud and pay attention to the sound. Anyone accustomed to reading poetry in translation can fall out of the habit of reading aloud and miss an essential element of a given poem, which may have rhythms or onomatopoeia, internal rhyme, slant rhyme, assonance or alliteration, and many other important oral qualities. As the translator Sam Hamill reminds us, poems are full of breath and sound, as well as images and illusions. In the first of these two haiku, there's alliteration, the repetition of the K sounds, which evokes perhaps the crispness of autumn air or of falling leaves, maybe even the quality of the fading late afternoon light. There's also the matter of number. Is there one crow or two, one branch or more? You don't have to specify in Japanese, but one has to choose in English, and it makes a big difference in the image that the reader winds up with. There's also the powerful impact of the final phrase, aki no yūgure, autumn evening, a phrase repeated many, many times in the centuries of waka that came before this haiku, and one which carries with it the overtones of those poems. For example, a sense of loneliness for those who recall the many famous precedents, such as Teika's Shinkokinshū poem, that evokes a profound sense of absence of color and of loneliness. Miwataseba, haru no momichi mo, haru mo momichi mo nakari kiri, ura no tomaya no aki no yūre. As I gaze afar, I see neither bright flowers nor autumn-colored leaves. A reed-thatched cottage by the bay, evening in autumn. The repeated sibilants of the second haiku, Shizukasa ya, are also important in emphasizing both the silence and the shrill cries of the cicadas that break it. And in this translation, I think the alliteration, along with the added punctuation in the English, do convey something of the oral quality, as well as the slightly surreal suggestion that the cicadas' cries are so sharp they penetrate the rocks. We could also discuss the form of these poems and their transformation in English. Both these translations convey the poems in 3 lines, but neither in 17 syllables. I'm generally a proponent of maintaining the form in my translations of the court anthologies, where I think the fact that all of the poems in these very long anthologies are examples of the same specific form really matters in giving the collection as a whole its shape. But somehow haiku seems to require a different approach. It's very easy to become overly wordy in haiku. I also generally avoid capital letters and punctuation as well, in imitation of Japanese orthography, which allows you to get sometimes a kind of double meaning in your English that's otherwise hard to get. I'll point out some instances of that later. In this poem, the added punctuation in the second poem has something of the effect of the cutting word ya in Japanese, so it can serve a function as well. There are many waka, too, that don't seem to demand particular information or specialized knowledge in order for a reader to appreciate them. For example, this waka from the Kokinshū by the 9th century poetess Ono no Komachi expresses an emotion any reader can appreciate, I think. Yumeji ni wa ashi mo yasumezu kayoe domo. utsutsu ni hitome mishigoto wa arazu. Though my feet never cease running to him on the byways of my dreams, such meetings do not equal one waking glimpse of my love. To enjoy this poem, it isn't absolutely necessary, for example, to know that the use of the contrasting pair of terms yume and utsutsu, dream and waking, was particularly popular with court poets who used them metaphorically to refer to Buddhist awakening or enlightenment and to the dreamlike state of existence in this secular world of samsara, as well as to refer to the real states of dream and wakefulness, as Komachi does. For the translator, grappling with the placement of these two terms presents a challenge too. Yume and utsutsu in Japanese are located at the beginnings of the two syntactic units, the first and fourth lines, where they're given extra weight, and that is something that I have not managed to do in English. Order of imagery and rhetorical constructs are particularly hard to maintain or convey in the translation because Japanese and English grammar are so different, with English front-loading the important information in a sentence or phrase, the subject and the verb, while Japanese sentences tend to build up to a powerful verbal or adjectival predicate preceded by the modifiers that would follow the verb in English. Japanese sentences don't even require and often only imply the subject, and that's something that one can rarely get away with in English. Many Kokinshū poems are similar to this anonymous one, a plaint by a disillusioned lover who now recognizes how fickle and untrustworthy her beloved has proven to be. Ide hito wa koto no mi, sorry, I can't see my paper anymore. Ide hito wa koto no mi zoyoki, tsukikusa no utsushi gokoro wa irokoto ni shite. My love is skillful only in words of love, like the dye made from the moongrass. The color of his heart lies lightly, fading soon. The language here again presents some challenges to the translator, beginning with the interjection, ide, which means something like well then, which I seem to have left out of this translation completely. The word hito can mean people or person, or as translated here, a particular person that I'm thinking of. I chose the specific in this case and made the poem about the faithless lover rather than choosing the general, people are like this, but both are equally possible in the Japanese. The repetition of love in the translation is a deliberate choice as well, an attempt to convey the effect of the repetition of koto with its two different meanings in Japanese, where it means both words and difference. The poem also includes an example of a common rhetorical device of Japanese poetry, the kakekotoba. Here we have a pivot or pun on utsushi, which means fading moongrass dye when linked with words that precede it, and shifting in constant heart with the syllables that follow. Kakekotoba is translated here by simile, a common if not entirely satisfactory solution, because English is much poorer in homonyms than Japanese. The word iro has a rich sense of meaning, also hard to convey in English. Its meaning can range from the straightforward color, by extension appearance, especially an appearance of beauty, to also include implications of erotic love. And all of these meanings, I think, are active in this particular poem. So one reason why these Japanese poems appeal across the centuries and across cultures is that they check all of the boxes on any list of what makes a good poem, no matter who's doing the defining. Various lists I've found include qualities such as these. Good poems are said to be provocative, inspiring, evocative, language-rich, surprising. They have interesting line breaks. They're informed by form, that is, they have a underlying structure. They avoid the cliched and typical. They reflect keen observation. They send a chill through the body. They surprise with language. They are written with a concise and accurate use of language. They can lift the reader out of the ordinary They have a mantric quality of language. They engage the heart of the reader and not just the mind. Good poetry is said to be poetry that we can feel an identification with. Well, clearly a conscientious translator should try to convey whichever of the qualities of a good poem the source language poem has, even though I think any good poem will also resist attempts to translate it at all. But the translator also has to deal with whatever specific features of the language and imagery and meaning can be discovered in the poem. And then there's a further challenge when it comes to grappling with complexities of cultural knowledge, with the connotations of words and phrases, with assumed knowledge of past events and literature of the past that the readers of the translation may lack. As one reads these poems, and especially perhaps as one attempts to translate them, one comes to realize that the unit in Japanese poetry is not so much the individual waka, but rather sequences or clusters of waka in which poems are linked to each other or echo each other in some fashion. In the Kokinshū, each of the 20 topically organized books of the anthology, and in some ways the entire anthology, functions as a unit. The Kokinshū set the pattern for the structure of the anthology, and it also largely set the limits for the topics and approaches to those topics that could be the basis for a waka. It begins with 6 books of seasonal poems that move chronologically through the seasons with the plants, animals, natural and atmospheric phenomena, and human events and celebrations that mark the passage of time in that season, making it clear how important the minutiae of the passing of time was to the Heian court. The second half of the anthology is dominated by 5 books of love poems, in which the individual poems carry us through the classic pattern of courtly love. The books open with poems on the first glimpse of the beloved and move on to love after meeting, fear of the future loss of love, and finally to the sadness and ultimately resignation that comes with the end of the affair. Other books focus on the topics of travel, congratulations, and grief. Within the books of the anthology, poems are linked or integrated by seasonal progression, use of related imagery and contiguous patterns, geographical progress from the mountains to the plains, to the villages, to the seashore, or from one famous place to another along a major thoroughfare, progress through the courtly love affair, use of similar or contrasting images and tones, use of similar and contrasting emotions, narrative development, grammatical or rhetorical similarity, and other means. The translator and the reader has to keep sequence in mind rather than focus solely on the individual poem. Progress within a sequence, or context within a sequence, or contrast or amplification because of juxtaposition can alter an interpretation, deepen the meaning, and even sometimes give a not very impressive poem more weight. The challenge then is to read enough waka to familiarize yourself with the coded language of waka and its use. We take a look at a poem that presents a situation of a woman awaiting the visit of her beloved. Ima kon to ishi bakari ni nagatsuki no ariake no tsuki o machi ire tsuru kana. By and by I'll come, he said, and so I waited patiently. But I saw only the moon of the longest month in the dawn sky. This particular poem from the 4th book of the love poems in the Kokinshū was written by the priest Sosei in the voice of a woman awaiting her lover, watching, still waiting with fading hopes as the moon gradually wanes in the autumn sky. Here again there are challenges to the translator. One is the matter of choosing a gender for the speaker. There is no subject given in the Japanese, nor are there any pronouns used. But it's nearly impossible to manage without them, and certainly impossible to be similarly ambiguous in English. Or at least I haven't managed it. Since we know men typically visited women with whom they had relationships in the Heian period, I've used a female speaker yearning for her neglectful lover in the English version, in spite of the actual gender of the author of this poem, a male priest. Another issue here is what might be called the slant translation of the traditional calendrical term, Nagatsuki, or long month, was one designation for the 9th month of the lunar calendar, the middle month of autumn, and the month of the harvest moon. Not a month longer than other months, except in the imagination of the lover waiting her beloved to no avail. I've elected to convey the emotional tenor at the expense of the specific designation of the month of the year, especially because the months of the lunar calendar don't match up with those of the solar calendar. They're about 6 weeks later. This poem by Henjo, Sosei's father, from the 5th book of Kokinshū love poems, is a variation on the same theme, that of the woman waiting increasingly hopelessly for her lover. Ima kon to iite wa karishi, ashita yori, omoi kurashi no ne, o no mizo naku. By and by I'll come, he said. But since that morning, my cries of sorrow blend only with the mournful droning of the cicadas. I might go with shrilling now that I think about it, rather than droning. Henjo's poem adopts Sosei's opening phrase with a slight variation. Ima kon to iishi. He said he would come, in Sosei's poem becomes ima kon to iite, saying he would come soon, in Henjo's. Henjo incorporates a different autumnal image, an auditory one, the endless shrilling, perhaps, of the cicadas, and he uses a kakekotaba, the phrase omoi kurashi, living on, grieving, or sorrowing, or living in reverie, pivots to higurashi no ne, the cry of the cicadas, while the cry is clearly that of the speaker as well as the insects. Surely any Heian poet hearing or reading one of these poems would have also thought of the other, so that the auditory imagery of Henjo's poem blends with the lovely visual scene of Sosei's. The poem that follows Henjo's in the Kokinshū offers yet another variation on the theme, opening komeya toa, thinking, won't he come? And continuing the auditory imagery of the persistent shrilling of the cicadas, while returning us chronologically to the early evening of what will surely seem an endless, lonely night, one the speaker endures again and again. Komeya toa, omou mono kara higurashi no nakuyu gure wa tachimatare tsutsu. Won't he come? Hopeless question. Yet with each passing night, I find myself going out to await him when cicadas cry at dusk. Kokinshū 774 has the anonymous author offer yet another take. The speaker, again likely a woman, is even more resigned. Ima wa kojito mo, I think you will not come. Yet every nightfall returns her to her yearning. Ima wa kojito mo monokara, wasure tsutsu mataruru koto no, mada mo yamanu ka. Now he will come no more. This I know. Yet each night I forget again unthinkingly. This is a place where my lack of punctuation lets me use unthinkingly with both the previous phrase and the following one, so makes it hard to read. I forget again, unthinkingly. I long for him, waiting, never ending. This poet makes use of another feature of the Japanese language that challenges the translator, complex modal verbal suffixes. In this case, as in the previous poem, the use of the suffix tsutsu, which means repeated action, hammers home the unending yearning of the speaker who says she's always forgetting, yet in doing so emphasizes all the more how she cannot forget. A second verbal ending in the poem, the ruru, or aruru in mataruru, adds the nuance called jihatsu in Japanese, something that happens of its own accord. Here the thing that happens is the awaiting, the endless waiting for the faithless lover, despite the speaker's stated awareness of her abandonment. A central feature of Japanese poetry is the use of these repeated words or phrases, which came to be called utamakura, literally poem pillow. Poetic words or phrases which cultivate allusion and intertextuality between individual poems and within the tradition. Ed Kamens has called these the richly signifying kernels or nodes within a poem through which the maker of that poem reaches out to make contact with other poems or other moments, and thus complicates or enriches the signifying process of the poem as a whole. The dictionary definition of illusion, which I won't read to you, reminds us that illusion is part of every world tradition, but I think perhaps the use of specific phrases to encapsulate illusion is more common in Japanese than the kind of general illusion or intertextuality that we find in other literary traditions. One thing the translator of Japanese poetry has to grapple with is how to convey illusion in those instances where the reader is unlikely to have the knowledge needed to appreciate them, whether to try to convey them at all, whether the burden of either lengthy notes or perhaps added explanatory material in the poem itself might not be more of a betrayal of the original poem than a straightforward translation left bare with the assumption or anticipation that the ideal readers of the translation will ferret out those allusions and their implications on their own. The importance of allusion runs throughout the courtly waka tradition, but it moves front and center in the Shinkokinshū. In Japanese court poetry, Robert Brower and Earl Minor write that a great age of neoclassical poetry, such as the era of the Shinkokinshū, has several prerequisites. There must be a definable tradition, such as the first imperial anthologies and Chinese poetry, for these Japanese writers of the late Heian and Kamakura periods. In addition, certain aspects of this tradition must seem indispensable to the later generations. In Japan, the past did indeed seem valuable in the decades of bloody warfare that brought an end to the Heian period. Poets saw the splendor of the court tradition darkening with the emerging power of the warrior clans. They turned to tradition in an attempt to give coherence to the confusion of their lives. As Shinkokinshū poets argued for retaining the diction of the earlier court anthologies, they committed themselves to using traditional images, words, and phrases which came to acquire an increasingly heavy freight of traditional associations. So we've touched on the repetition of phrases such as Aki no Yugure, or autumn evening, and tropes such as the waiting woman that can carry the freight of tradition and emotion because of the audience's familiarity with other poems that incorporate those phrases or address the situation. Techniques such as the use of utamakura, specific words, phrases, or images that are codified for poetic use, and the subcategory called meisho, or place names, that carry an aura of connotation and association through their use in earlier poetry, play an important role in the transmission of waka, in that poets of generation after generation return either in person or in the imagination to these places and to the poems about them, to encounter again the forms, styles, and techniques of their forebearers and to discover ways to create new poems of their own. Often the meisho, or place names with poetic associations, have important literal meanings as well, such as Osaka, which means meeting hill. Some 350 of these place names play an important role in the waka poetic tradition. This poem, again from the Kokinshū by Tsureyuki, focuses on a particular place name, one which had already become a meisho in the early 10th century. Kimi masade keburi tayanishi, shiogama no urasabishiku mo miewataru kana. Now my lord is gone. How lonely is this world, where far across the bay of Shiogama, the gray smoke disappears from our sight. This poem was composed after the death of the courtier Minamoto no Toru, when Tsureyuki visited Toru's mansion and saw his now abandoned and decaying garden. The garden had been Toru's grand project, designed in imitation of the actual scenery of the far-off Shiogama. The name Shiogama literally means salt cauldron, and the site was inseparable from salt making, or images of salt making. Toru is said to have replicated the Shiogama of his imagination to the extent that he had salt water carted into his garden and boiled there to make the steam and smoke that were part of the real Shiogama scene. Shiogama no Ura, Shiogama Bay, functions as a kakekotoba in this poem. The place name Shiogama no Ura pivots to the phrase Urasabishiku mo miyawataru, looks so lonely. In Tsurayuki's poem, the pivot from bay to so lonely underscores the shift that the garden has undergone, and Tsurayuki's memory of the salt smoke that once filled the garden now calls to mind the smoke from Toru's funeral pyre as well. Now it too has disappeared from sight, leaving a void. When Tsurayuki composed his poem on the death of Toru and the changes wrought by the passage of time, he was joining a community who had already written extensively about Shiogama. Toru, an emperor's son who had been reduced to commoner status, had chosen to model the garden of his mansion on Shiogama, a place he likely had never seen. It was surely poems like this anonymous Eastern poem, or Azuma Uta, that were being gathered for inclusion in the Kokinshū that stimulated his imagination and attracted him to this far-off place. Michinoku wa izuku wa aredo, Shiogama no urakobu fune no tsunade kanashimo. Northern provinces, lovely wherever you go. Spellbinding this sight of men towing a boat to row across Shiogama. We know from a story in the Tales of Issei that Toru invited others to his garden to share the pleasure of illusion and imaginary travel. What we see here is the construction of sites, real or imaginary, that could both convey poems of the past through their power to recall them to mind, and could stimulate new poetry, undergirded by allusions to those poems. By the time of the Shinkokinshū, poets recalled a cluster of earlier Shiogama poems and could use them as the foundation of their own compositions. I hope you can see this. Here's one by Fujiwara no Kanezane, who bases his composition on Tsurayuki's poem, transporting himself in imagination to Shiogama itself, instead of to the artificial Shiogama Tsurayuki had viewed. Furuyuki ni takumo no keburi kakitaete, sabishiku mo aru ka, Shiogama no ura. With the falling snow, smoke rising from the burning seaweed disappears. How lonely it is here at the bay in Shiogama. Kanezane quotes and reworks a few words of Tsurayuki's poem, while adding falling snow as a counterpoint to the rising smoke of the earlier scene. His poem has crisp consonants, maybe the snapping fire that shift to soft sibilants in the last two lines. I've lost the crisp consonants, I'm afraid, but was able to do something else that I try to do when possible, at least, which is at least to roughly maintain the order of the introduction of imagery in a poem. So we have the falling snow, then the seaweed smoke rising and vanishing, and then the expression of loneliness followed by the designation of the place in the last line, where it has real weight. Certain practices in poetic composition and in the reception of poetry of the past developed to transmit the poetic tradition from one generation to the next. What we see in this string of Shiogama poems is that in addition to rhetorical devices, compositional practices played a major role in the transmission of the waka tradition. As the topics for waka came to be more and more formalized, dai, or composition on a set topic, became more prominent, and the related expectations that the poet would express the hongi, or essential character, of the topic as it had come to be defined in earlier poetry, became a central feature of waka. Honkadori, or elusive variation on an earlier poem, which is called the honka, or foundation poem, and honzetsu, allusion to a famous work of prose literature of the past, such as Genji Monogatari or Issei Monogatari, helped poets engage in the circulation of coded language, both as poets or audience. Poems were frequently composed for occasions such as poetry matches, or to accompany screen paintings, or as part of a 100-poem sequence, or as part of travel records, when they were written as though confronting a Bashō in the imagination. By the Shinkokinshū era, the assumption was that any given waka had been composed on a set topic, and those poems whose topics were unknown were identified in the anthology as Dai Shirazu, topic unknown. This poem by Teika is an example of Dai. It's composed on the topic Love Beneath the Moon. Teika writes, Matsuyama to chigirishi hito wa sore nakute sore kosu nami ni nokoru tsuki kage. Like Waiting Mountain, he vowed he would be constant, yet cruel he is, for waves of love now soak these sleeves where the moonlight still gleams. Waiting, or Matsu Mountain, is a reference to Sueno Matsu Mountain, over which waves are said to rise in the foundation poem, the Honka, the anonymous Kokinshū 1093. The name Sueno Matsuyama literally means tip of the pine mountain, but Matsu also has the meaning to wait, which immediately returns us to the waiting woman trope and suggests a female speaker. The Kokinshū poem, Kimi o gite adashi gokoro o wagamata ba Sueno Matsuyama nami mo koyenan. If ever I should change my mind and banish you from my heart, then would great ocean waves rise and cross Sueno Matsuyama, the Sueno Matsu Mountain. Poets of the Shinkokinshū were particular partisans of Honkadori, and it's a striking aspect of Shinkokinshū poetry. Nearly half of Shinkokinshū poems have one or more honka. It's a feature that goes a long way to explain the qualities of profundity and mysterious depth and layering of meaning that are associated with the best poetry of this anthology. I have more examples, but I'm moving along. Several Shinkokinshū poems take Sosei's poem that we read before as their foundation poem. The by and by I'll come, he said, and so I waited patiently, but I saw only the moon of the longest month in the dawn sky. This poem by Fujiwara no Hideyoshi quotes Sosei's by this time well-worn opening phrase, but makes the poem new by changing the speaker. No longer is the speaker the waiting woman found in the Kokinshū poem on the theme, but now it's the lover who argues that not only is he not as faithless as he had been portrayed, but that he's as empathetic as well, and that he's thoroughly familiar with the poetic tradition and the trope. He writes, Ima kon to tanomeshi koto o wasurezu wa kono yugure no tsuki ya matsuran. By and by I'll come, I said, and if you have not forgotten my vow, then surely this evening you anxiously await the moon. This poem, too, takes Sosei's as its honka. In it, Yoshitsune returns us to the female speaker, the betrayed and waiting woman, but leaves a great deal for the reader to fill in from knowledge of the poems of the past. And so now we can fill it in. Iwazariki imakon made no sora no kumo tsukihi hedatete mono omoe to wa. You never said, I'll return soon, so pass the months and days in brooding, looking at clouds in the sky that obscure the sun and moon. But. We've had enough by and by poems. When a Shinkokinshū poet writes on a particular topic or evokes a particular image, then his or her goal is to convey the cluster of emotional and aesthetic attitudes and associations developed by the literary tradition with regard to the particular topic, the hongi. In his treatise on poetry, the Shinkokinshū poet Shinsei invokes Tsurayuki's Japanese preface to the Kokinshū, not to celebrate Tsurayuki's view that poetry emerges from direct response to the things and events of the world, but rather to argue that poetry is born of poetry of the past. He writes, as stated in the preface to the Kokinshū, Japanese poetry takes the human heart as its seed and grows into a myriad leaves of words. Thus, without Japanese poetry, even if people visited the spring blossoms or viewed the autumn leaves, no one would know their color or splendor. Without Japanese poetry, what might we take as their true spirit? As Haruo Shirane has observed, when Shinsei views the world around him, nature and the passage of the seasons serve only as a reminder to Shinsei of various aspects of nature as they exist as figures, tropes, and signs in classical Japanese poetry. So now that I've getting to the end. Now that I've examined some of the rhetorical and compositional practices of classical Japanese poets, I'd like to turn briefly to some of the transmission practices that Japanese poets have used to practice the poetic tradition, to bring themselves into alignment with its expectations and to polish and stimulate their own imaginations and poetic production. These practices, which I'm calling experiential learning, include practices such as the poetry competition, in which poets compose waka on assigned topics and match them against poems by another team. A judge would choose the winner in each pair and generally give reasons for the judgment. I've used this technique in the classroom, and probably many of you have as well, by having teams choose poems that they've read on a set of designated topics and match them against the choices of the other team, with each team arguing for the strengths of their choice. A team of judges can make the ultimate decisions. Byobu uta, or screen poems, were typically composed by heian courtiers who, after paintings had been produced on screens that were used for their dwellings, the poet would imagine him or herself at the site that was depicted in the painting. I've turned this around with students by having them draw, sketch, or paint scenes to pair with the poems that they choose. And I've expanded this also by allowing them to compose or asking them to compose or perform music based on poems that they've selected. Tray gardens or dioramas, mini versions of the Shiogama garden, are another option for such an activity, and have been a good end of the semester kind of culminating activity. 100 poem sequences were composed by courtiers as kind of mini anthologies. We can do it in a classroom with maybe 10 poems. Students choose poems that they see as being linked one to the other and bring their 10 to class to share with each other. Poem tales are anecdotes that were kind of fictional anecdotes, typically centered on one or more poems, in which the author imagines and tells the story of the circumstances of the composition of the poems. This is particularly popular with students in my experience. They enjoy imagining what kind of a situation a poem might have been composed in. And courtiers' diaries incorporate large numbers of poetry, since the courtiers were often called upon to compose poetry in formal and informal settings in their lives. While I haven't had students producing poetic diaries yet, we've done travel diaries, or kikobun, on several occasions, and I'll return to this after just a brief look at one of the greatest of the authors of poetic travel diaries, Bashō, who set off in the spring of 1689 on a journey of 5.5 months, about 1,500 kilometers through northern Japan. He'd spent much of the previous 5 years on the road visiting places and people that were meaningful to him, but also making contact with people and lives of the past by visiting the places that had been meaningful to people of old. Waka poets, Nenga poets, earlier authors of his own genre of haikai, and others of the past who produced travel diaries and fiction and no plays, historical figures such as Minamoto no Yoshitsune and others who were caught up in the Genpei Wars of the 12th century. When Bashō and his disciple Sora traveled into northern Japan in the late 17th century, he had many goals, but one of the main ones was to visit the sites that people of the past, who he calls kojin, visit the sites that they visited and to experience them for himself. When they arrived on the outskirts of Sendai City, Bashō and Sora met a woodblock carver named Kayamon, who spent an entire day guiding them to some of the famous places whose locations had become uncertain over the years. That's Bashō. One of them was Shiogama, where Bashō recalled this poem written by Murasaki Shikibu, author of the tale of Genji, when she was looking at paintings of various famous places in northern Japan. Murasaki's poem is included in the Shinkokinshū. It goes, Mishi hito no keburi to narishi, yube yori, nazo utsumajiki, Shiogama no ura. Since that evening when one I loved so well changed to drifting smoke, your very name is dear to me, Shiogama on the bay. Mutsu is a name for the northern Honshu provinces, and the word Mutsumajiki, deer in Murasaki's poem, suggests the place name where Shiogama was located. The smoke of the salt kilns recalls the drifting smoke rising from the crematorium. That evening, Bashō writes, at Shiogama Bay, a bell sounded evening. The summer rain sky cleared to reveal a pale moon high over Magaki Island. I remembered the fishing boats pulling together in a Kokinshū poem and understood it clearly for the first time. The Bashō takes us back full circle by way of Murasaki's waka, back to Toru's decaying garden and Kino Tsurayuki's poem, lamenting Toru's death, and to the anonymous Kokinshū Eastern poem that Tsurayuki alludes to, as these poets talk to each other across the centuries. A short walk from Shiogama is Sueno Matsuyama, and I have a bunch of Sueno Matsuyama poems, but I will save those in case somebody wants to talk about them later. And just wind up with, Bashō was a student and admirer of poets and artists of the past, and he and other waka, benga, and haikai poets' poetic practices can provide a guide for us in coming to understand the Japanese poetic tradition, seeking to understand and experience what the original poet experienced, right down to the compositional practices that ask us to journey into our own interiors to respond and to find ways to verbalize those responses. To recap, we can emulate poets of the past in their practice by doing such things as writing our own poetry on variations on some of the themes that we find in them, by reorganizing existing poetry into poetry contests or mini anthologies of however many poems, by writing poem tales about them, thinking about how they might have been composed, by creating artificial sites or reflections of poetry in other media, such as tree gardens or illustrations, etc., and by our own travel to Bashō and composition of travel diaries. That's where we come to the image that was in the poster. In 2000 and 2009, I was able to take groups of students along Bashō's route into northern Japan. Like Bashō, we followed in the footsteps of these people of the old and stood on the sites they visited, recollected the poetry they had composed, and composed our own linked verse and haiku. Here we have Mike composing his own haiku at Yamadera, which is the setting of the poem, one of the poems with which we began, Shizukasa ya Iwa ni shimiru semi no koe. Silence penetrating the rocks, cicadas' cries. The experience of standing on these sites and reading what was written, imagining those poets of the past, just as they themselves imagined their predecessors, affected us profoundly. I encourage you, too, as you read Japanese poetry in the original or in translation, not just to read it, but to seek out the links to other poems and to the tradition, to try to find the poetic essence, to try your own hand at some of the Japanese poets' practices, in short, to follow in their footsteps. Thank you.